My name is John V. Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is David Levy, a Beethoven specialist and professor of music at Wake Forest University. He is a native of New York City and graduated from LaGuardia High School, which specialized in music and art. Subsequently, he attended the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, earning his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate from there. David, how did you make your way to Chautauqua?
Well, I started in 1966. I had studied at Eastman for a year, studied violin with my teacher, Abe Boone. And Abe Boone said, I want you to study with Millard Taylor this summer at Chautauqua. Of course, I had never heard of Chautauqua, but it turns out a friend of mine was going to be playing in the CSO that summer, and a tenor who was going to be singing in the opera company. We decided to rent an apartment together, and I discovered it then as a music student. I played in the MSFO, as it was back then, and took lessons with Mr. Taylor, and had a wonderful experience, never expecting to come back again after that.
And what was your instrument then?
Violin.
Mm-hmm.
I was a violin student.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand along your academic time, you had a German fellowship, DAAD fellowship, and you spent time in Munich. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. I stayed in Rochester at Eastman for my master's, and at that point I had been in school ever since kindergarten, and I thought it would be good for me to get away from being in the classroom, being a student in that sense, and work on learning German better, because German is an essential language for the kind of research I do. And I wanted a chance to go overseas. So I applied for Fulbright, and back then the Institute of International Education would put your application into play for different organizations that sponsored overseas study. The Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, that's the DAAD, placed me, and that was the way I got over to study in Munich. I had a specific research project in mind. Didn't quite pan out, but it was a tremendous year of growth.
Mm-hmm. Now, were you able to travel in Europe during that year?
I did, actually. Well, we bought a car and picked it up in Munich, and we had met a number of American students over there, and we traveled to various places, to the Rhineland first, where there was an orientation for all DAAD American students. We had a week in Berlin. We drove to Vienna, went to Salzburg, and explored mainly the German-speaking part of Europe during that year.
Did you go into East Berlin, East Germany at all?
I did. When we were in Berlin, this was 1972, it was still a divided city, and my wife and our baby son and I decided with some friends that we would go into the east. Mm-hmm. At which point you had to take a train, an S-Bahn, to go from the West Berlin to East Berlin side, and you had to exchange your money at the border for West German marks for East German marks at a one-to-one exchange. Of course, the East German mark wasn't worth nearly as much as the West German mark, but we did so. And we walked around East Berlin, and parts of it looked like World War II had just ended. Other parts of it were really quite beautiful, especially the great boulevard called Unter den Linden, and we found that to be rather beautiful. And we turned the corner off Unter den Linden one part of that day in East Berlin, and we turned down a small side street, and there was a tank looking at us. Now, you have to understand, this was late April, and they were getting ready for the traditional May Day parade, which then, of course, the communist capitals, they would have military parades. And that was a rather shocking moment.
Oh, my goodness. I hope you're not aiming this thing at you. Now, a major part of that was a significant part of your graduate education, was it not, at that time in Europe?
It was a very important time for me. Not only did I enhance my German language skills, but I had developed some research techniques. I took classes at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, and I took a pro seminar, in fact, in Bach's keyboard works, and a number of students were making presentations, and I felt bold enough to offer to give one, so I went to the professor and said I'd like to hold a referat, and which I did, and I got some help from my landlady in the place where I was staying in outside of Munich, and it came off rather well. I was rather pleased, but it took what we call a certain amount of chutzpah on my part.
We're going to go for this. No,
Yeah.
No problem. Now, you spent a year in Europe, and then you returned to Rochester.
Correct.
And did you had a break in service to work for a while?
Well, what I did when we got back to Rochester was to pick up the remainder of my PhD classwork. I began a cognate in German literature at the River campus of the U of R,
Right.
which was also a tremendous experience for me, insofar as I have used what I've learned in those classes in my own work, and I'm very grateful for having had that opportunity. My wife was a member of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. She's a flutist, and she plays flute and piccolo in the Chautauqua Symphony. I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually had it pretty well off, considering I was a graduate student. My tuition was paid for. Kathy was working full-time, and it was really terrific. At that point, I began to work on my doctoral dissertation ideas, and then in 1976, we moved from Rochester to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, when I was hired by Wake Forest University.
Right. Now, a major part of your graduate school experience is the research project. Can you tell me about the process of selecting a topic?
Yes. Well, you know, there was a young professor with whom I was working very closely when I returned from Germany. His name was Gerald Growe. And there was a fellow who was on the faculty who had written a dissertation on the works of Handel. And I said to Jerry that I would love to be able to work on a major composer. And he knew that I had a particular fondness for the music of Beethoven. So he suggested to me that I do some preliminary research on the Ninth Symphony and its reception, that is, how it was greeted by critics and audiences in its early years. Well, as I began to develop that idea and do the basic fundamental groundwork, I discovered there was a lot that had not been done, and from that I ended up writing my dissertation, which covered the first 25 years of the work's existence in 5 different European cities.
And where did you do field research for the dissertation?
I did most of it actually in the library. I didn't have to travel very much. What I had to do was slog through 19th century journals in German, in English, because London was one of the cities that I covered.
Mm-hmm.
French, I had to read quite a bit of French in the French journals of the 19th century. And that actually I had to read some Italian as well. The biggest challenge for my dissertation was translating these reviews into idiomatic English. Not an easy task.
Right. Now, that library work was done at Rush Reese in Rochester?
Most of it actually was done in the Sibley Library.
Sibley
The Sibley
Library.
Music Library is a treasure.
Yeah.
It is the greatest collegiate music collection in the United States.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
But I did have to travel a little bit to other libraries. The New York Public Library, for example, had some resources that Sibley did not have. And other places I was able to send away for microfilms.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that way I was able to access all the sources that I needed.
Right. One of the things, that's sort of an aside here, that surprised me when we started talking about this is the way our paths have crossed.
Yes.
We had a year when both of us were in Rochester downtown. You were at Eastman School in East Rochester. I was in West Rochester at RIT as a photo student. And then we were both working in the libraries of the University of Rochester doing dissertation research.
Correct.
75 to 76.
Amazing. Same time.
That's right.
Yep.
And didn't know one another, but I'm certain we rubbed shoulders somewhere along the way.
Well, I'm glad that we know each other now.
I
John.
do too, I am too. And one of the people I always wanted to interview, and we met at the dinner which our friend Naomi Kaufman set up in Raleigh, and actually the video of that runs on Access Channel 5.
Right.
Reruns.
Right.
Okay, so you did your field work, or you did most of your dissertation research in libraries, and the major part of dissertation then is sharing it. Can you tell us how you disseminated your results?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. After I had finished the doctorate, I felt a little bit burned out, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I already had won the full-time teaching job at Wake Forest. And of course, when you start out as a new professor, you want to work on your teaching. And I sort of set the Ninth Symphony project aside for a while, but then I decided I really ought to try to get some of this published. So I wrote to a number of likely publishers, and of course very often you receive lots and lots of refusals. But eventually I heard from an editor, Mary Beth Payne Anderson, who was then with Schirmer Books, which is a division of Macmillan Press. And after a few weeks, I heard back from her, and she said, I like your writing very much. I like the content of what you have to say, but we're developing a new series called Masterworks of Western Music. And I think that you'd be the right guy to write a book on the Ninth Symphony, but it would be a different kind of a book from what you've sent me. It could include what you sent me, but it would be more comprehensive. Well, of course, I didn't have to think very long about accepting that possibility. So she flew me up to New York City to meet with the general editor of the series, a man named George Stauffer. And we talked over a whole day and mapped out a proposal which was accepted. And I signed a contract with Schirmer Books. And the book was originally published in 1995 in hardback. There were 2 other books, or 3 or 4 actually, other books in the series that were published after mine. And then we decided that the 3 best-selling books, mine, George's own book on Bach, and another book on the Brahms symphonies, were doing so well that we signed a contract with Yale University Press. And this new revised edition of my book appeared in 2003 and is still in print.
Was it a major revision?
I added a few things because there had been new discoveries about the Ninth Symphony. A brand new edition had been published in Germany, which conductors were starting to use. And I had reviewed that edition very carefully and found some problems with it. And I had a chance in the revised edition to include that as well.
Right. Now, let me ask you sort of a broad question. We'll bring this to the more specific issue. Basically, how do performances of major works differ from one another? And as a expert in the field, what do you listen for?
Well, there are lots of things. I can talk more specifically about the Ninth Symphony, which, as you know, the CSO just performed, and quite beautifully at that. What I listen for primarily is tempo. What speed has the conductor chosen? And will that speed serve the music as I know it? Now, as you can understand, I have studied Beethoven's Ninth up one side and down the other. I had the privilege even of seeing the original manuscript, or most of the original manuscript, in the library in Berlin, the Prussian State Library. And I can tell you that was a great thrill to be able to hold in my hands the autographed manuscript of the piece. But there are many, many issues concerning tempo and speed that are important. We've also learned a great deal from the phenomenon of modern performances on old instruments, which has given us a sense of what the balance is between winds and brass and percussion and strings. And that has been very informative. So what pleased me about the performance of the Beethoven Ninth, for example, that we just heard at Chautauqua, was that, especially in the first part of the second movement, the scherzo, the third movement, which I thought was just wonderful in terms of speeds and balance, I was thrilled with how well it was performed. And with the famous finale with the Ode to Joy, well, the best performance of Beethoven's Ninth is the one that lives in my head. So I always use that as the measuring stick for any performance that I hear. But these, for most people, would be small matters. The piece is an important piece. It's a great piece. And I would say that, any performance of any piece of music that I know, these are the kinds of criteria I bring to the table as a listener. But I would never be the one to spoil somebody else's enjoyment of a performance.
Right.
Although I get asked very often, well, what did you think? Because they're looking for an expert opinion. Well, I can give them my opinion, but I'm very careful to first ask them, well, how did you enjoy it?
Right. Right. So let's take a look at your writing for just a minute.
Sure.
And let's take a look at the book, and then we'll get narrow on the others. So this is the book which was published, and this is the Yale edition, is it not?
Correct.
Okay. And I was able to order a copy of this, and shortly before I came, I got an email saying it's on its way.
Okay.
So
I'll be happy to sign it. It might be worth another $1.
That's we'll take you up on that.
Okay.
Now, a part of your Chautauqua experience then and we'll come back to this, but let's talk about it with the writing, is to prepare program notes for the symphony. And you had wonderful notes here, but there's a little thing that sort of caught my eye as a former brass player when you spoke about the performers. You're married to a woodwind player.
Yes.
And so you outlined the woodwinds.
Yes.
Then you outlined the brass and strings. And I said, that's the right order. That's the right order.
And my wife would agree also.
So I understand how that goes in.
Well, I'm glad you approve.
But I would tell you, and this is absolutely sincere. When we had our pre-meeting and talked about this, I went and looked on the web and found several videos of Beethoven's Ninth. And what I want to do then is to sit down with this very quietly, probably after Chautauqua, and go through and look at your notes and see how it comes.
Oh, well, I'd like to hear what you find and what you learn.
Yeah.
There's no one thing I think was very important in my work on this project was something that George Stauffer, my editor, said. He said, there is no last word about great works of art. You just give it your best thinking, and there may be something new that will be discovered later on, and it's even possible that you could be proven wrong on some point or another.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings a sense of, I would say, humility to any research project that I do. But I feel, as a scholar, as a teacher, privileged to work with the music of Beethoven. And I have had many, many opportunities since my work on the Ninth to work with autographed manuscripts, with sketches, with letters, authentic letters. And I feel like I'm in a sort of a rarefied group of scholars internationally who get to work on the music of this great master.
Now, I understand that you once led a performance of it.
This is true.
Tell us about it.
Yes, Wake Forest University in 1996 and 97 decided to have a focus year of the arts. And each of the arts departments, the fine arts, the theater, and the music department were given a budget to have a major project. And I convinced my colleagues that this would be a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with a symposium ahead of it, bringing in some of my colleagues from other universities, and a chamber music concert, and then to hire the Winston-Salem Symphony and bring in our own students to join with the Winston-Salem Symphony, have the college choir and any members of the college community to join in, would be a wonderful way to bring people together.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly the spirit of the Schiller's text in the finale of the Ninth Symphony. It's about embracing all kinds of people and all different peoples together. So my colleagues agreed. Two of my colleagues who taught voice were two of the guest soloists. We hired two alumni to come back and sing the other vocal parts.
Wonderful.
And it was one of the great privileges and thrills of my life, to be sure.
Eager to do it again?
Oh, if I had a chance to do it again, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. Let's just take a look here. This is the article from today's Daily, and this shows the picture of the soloists up front, and they look immensely happy, do they not, giving this performance. And I assume you had the same experience then in Whitechapel.
Always. Oh, yes. Oh. But it was a very hot day. You could have wrung me out like a dish rag at the end of the performance.
Mm-hmm.
It takes such immense concentration to conduct that piece, especially the last movement, because there are 11 distinct sections, each in a different tempo. And you have to really apply all of your knowledge and skill. Now, it's not like I had never conducted before I gave that performance. I had conducted many, many musical theater productions, including operettas. I had conducted symphonic works. But the Ninth Symphony was far and away the greatest challenge. And it is a great challenge for any conductor because of the pitfalls in the changes of tempo and keeping the ensemble together. After all, you're dealing with a fairly large orchestra.
Right.
I had a chorus of 120 singers. And to keep all of that together on a limited number of rehearsals was a challenge. But I'm happy to say that for the most part I rose to the challenge. You'd always like to have a second chance, so
Yeah.
as you said, if I had another chance to do it, I wouldn't hesitate.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. One of the things in reviewing the material for this that I didn't know is in so many areas, and some of them were we would regard as naughty people back in pre-war Germany, where it became a New Year's Eve piece. And I guess the Japanese still practice that, do they not?
Oh, they do it. December is the Daikyu month in Japan.
Right.
Daikyu is Big Nine
Right.
in Japanese, and that's how they refer to Beethoven's Ninth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we talk about performances of Daikyu in Japan, we're talking about thousands of performers. Huge orchestra with lots and lots of doubled winds, brass, and strings. Choruses of multiple of thousands of people. And they sing it in German.
Isn't that wonderful?
And when you ask a Japanese person who sings in Daikyu, why do you do it? The answer is, it makes me feel good. They don't necessarily plug into the text and the meaning of the text
Right.
as much as maybe other audiences might. But it says it makes them feel good. But the piece has also taken on political overtones over its life, for good and for bad. Adolf Hitler, for example, wanted a performance of the Ninth Symphony to be to celebrate his birthday
Oh, goodness.
in April. And the German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler delayed doing that, conducting it, until he was forced to do it in 1942.
Oh, my goodness.
It was a favorite of communist regimes. But it also represented, in 1989, two important lives that were political. One was in Berlin, when the wall came down.
Right.
And
November.
in December 25th of 1989, Leonard Bernstein brought Eastern and Western musicians together to give a ceremonial performance of Beethoven's Ninth. The other was happened several months before in Beijing, where the Chinese students who were protesting against the government and gathering in Tiananmen Square had loudspeakers, and they were playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy
Goodness.
to inspire them. The same thing that was true during the Pinochet regime in Chile. In fact, there's a film about this called Following the Ninth that was made by a California film director, Kerry Candell, called Following the Ninth, and I think that's available on Amazon and other sources,
I'll have to look
that
at
deals
that.
with the political life of the Ninth Symphony.
Goodness. Goodness. I would love to go and see one of those performances. And I wish we
Yeah,
had it.
yeah.
I wish it was easy to see one in the United States on New Year's Eve, and particularly it sounds like if some of them were timed so that the fourth movement begins with the Ode to Joy begins right about
Right at midnight.
Yeah.
That would be great. What they do in Vienna is they don't perform the Ninth Symphony on New Year's Day. Everybody knows about the New Year's Day Pops concert that the Vienna Philharmonic gives.
Right.
It's broadcast internationally. But they also perform in multiple venues the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven, which was the other great choral work from the last years of his life.
Right.
And I happened to arrive in Vienna in time to go to one of those New Year's Day performances,
Oh.
and it was such a great experience.
Oh my goodness. This is a good transition. Tell me about your interest in Wagner and some of your activities for the university.
Well, my interest in Wagner really links back to Beethoven in a very important way. Wagner himself worshipped the Ninth Symphony. In 1832, he had made a transcription of it for piano and offered it to a music publisher in exchange for some scores. He also performed it when he laid the foundation stone for his festival theater in Bayreuth in 1872. In a sense, that's when the Ninth Symphony got its halo, if you will, became the sort of sacrosanct work that it has become. But Wagner, you could not imagine the Flying Dutchman, you could not imagine the beginning of Das Rheingold without the model of Beethoven's Ninth. And Wagner himself said after Beethoven's Ninth, the symphony as a genre was dead. Well, that was his opinion, of course.
Right.
But he said the only way forward is to join voices and instrumental music together. So my work on Beethoven led quite naturally, I would say, into my interest in Wagner. Although I had already known many of Wagner's operas by then and really loved them. And in fact, as teacher, as a professional, I had a chance to study at NYU during one summer in a fellowship from NEH with the late Robert Bailey, who was, at that time, the greatest Wagner expert in the United States. And having to spend a whole 6 to 8 weeks with Bob Bailey studying the Wagner operas was really a great, great experience.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turns out, Bob Bailey was also on the committee when I defended my dissertation. So these connections were all really quite smooth and quite natural. And I love teaching the Ring to Wake Forest students.
Goodness. Okay. Now tell me about the Wake Forest Center in Vienna.
Yes, Wake Forest has really invested a lot of its money and resources, time, and in other ways, efforts to increase international education. We acquired in the 1960s property in Venice, a house called Casa Artem, which is right next to the Peggy Guggenheim Museum on the Grand Canal.
Modern art in there.
Yes, and then they acquired in the 1970s a property in London, thanks to a gift from a newspaper publisher in Virginia, Mr. Worrell. We have Worrell House in Hampstead.
Mm-hmm.
And then the then president of Wake Forest University, the late Thomas Hearn, and the chairman of the board of trustees at the time were both interested in Vienna. They loved Vienna. Tom Hearn was a philosopher. He was fascinated with Wittgenstein. And they decided that Wake Forest needed to have a house in a German-speaking city. And they decided that Vienna was the place. Well, when I heard that, of course, I was immediately drawn to it. And we opened up our place, which is called Flow House, named for Don Flow, F-L-O-W, not the German spelling, which would be actually a bad pun, because the German spelling would be flea.
Yeah.
So we spelled it deliberately F-L-O-W. Flow House in the 19th district of Vienna. And it's a villa, beautiful villa, which can house up to 16 students and a faculty member and his or her family. I've had the privilege of teaching at Flow House now 3 times. I have one more term coming to teach there in 2018. But I am director of the program, so I help select the professors who get to go over. And we serve all disciplines. It's not just music. But when you think about the 3 houses, Venice for visual art, London for theater, and Vienna for music, it's sort of a perfect matches made in heaven.
Well, I'm glad you do all disciplines, because this Wake Forest MBA graduate would love to pay a visit.
Well, as I think we
House.
discussed the possibility of making that happen.
We've got to work out something.
I'd love to do that for
Now,
you, John.
I got 2 more questions we're going over. These guys always indulge me, and they probably talk bad about me, saying he talks too much. But you've got to tell us about what your responsibilities are at Chautauqua.
Right. Well, when I first came, I have to explain, after my year as a student, of course, 10 years elapsed, my wife was a member of the Rochester Philharmonic in 1976, and it turns out the 2 seasons before that she had subbed as a piccolo player in the Chautauqua Symphony for a couple of concerts. And then when the then piccolo player retired from the orchestra, Kathy won the job. At that time, our children were quite young. Well, we had actually just one child at the time, but he was young. And my responsibility was to, first of all, finish my dissertation. Secondly, shop and cook. And I spent my many, many hours sitting every day at the typewriter. There were no computers yet, working on my dissertation. So I didn't really get to appreciate and understand what Chautauqua had to offer. Of course, I went to the concerts. That was to be expected. But then, after a while, the kids grew up. My responsibilities changed. I taught 9 summers at the Eastman School of Music. Graduate seminars were assigned to me, which was a wonderful experience. And then at Chautauqua, when Lee Spears retired, Marty Merkley approached me and asked if I'd be willing to do the pre-concert talks in Horbit Sanctuary for many of the concerts. I think there are 11 this season, and to write the program notes for the regular symphony concerts as opposed to I don't do the ballet
Yeah.
programs or the pops.
Right.
So Marty asked me to think about it, and I thought this was a really natural thing for me to do. So my job at Chautauqua now, besides my enjoying the lectures and playing tennis and golf, I'm an avid golfer, is to give the pre-concert talks, which I enjoy doing very much.
Mhm.
The Chautauqua audiences are terrific. They're smart people who ask smart questions. And I tell them, as I tell my students, there's no such thing as a dumb question if it's an honest question.
Right.
So I'm thrilled to have that responsibility, and I hope to be able to continue doing it well into the future.
Right. Now, what are your spouse's responsibilities here at
Well,
Chautauqua?
she plays flute and piccolo in
Okay.
the CSO.
Okay.
This is our 42nd season. It's hard to believe.
Goodness.
Time flies.
Goodness.
When we've made a lot of ties and friends here. So she, at one time, taught, when they had a high school orchestra, taught the flute students.
Right.
Now she has no teaching responsibilities, except Rick Sherman, the principal flute, asks her once a season to work with the student flutists here on piccolo playing.
Right.
And her job is to practice and perform. The orchestra gives lots of concerts in a short amount of time, so she practices constantly and getting ready for the next thing.
Right.
Not to mention the operas, of course.
And then, and what does she do when she's in Winston?
She's principal flutist in the Winston-Salem Symphony. She teaches at Wake Forest University as professor of the practice, and she has some private students who study with her at home. She does a lot of different things. She's also a Sunday school teacher at our synagogue. So
Right. Right.
she's a busy woman.
Right. And last question. Tell us where you live when you're here in Chautauqua.
We have a house right here in Mayville.
Isn't that
It's
nice?
with about a half a mile away from where we're seated now.
Great.
And we love being Mayvillians, and we love our neighbors. We love this house. And someday, when I eventually retire, I'd like to spend more months up here enjoying Mayville and Chautauqua County.
Great. Great. Is there anything else we need to discuss?
Oh, we could go on forever, but I think we've probably gone on longer than we should.
But this was great fun.
John, it was a great pleasure.
Do come back.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been Chautauqua People and my guest, David Levy.